Do you feel like you were born in two worlds at once? Not quite analog, not quite digital, but suspended in between. A world where afternoons could be quiet and unmonitored, where phones lived on walls and not in pockets, where missing a call was just normal. And then, almost without warning, the world changed. Connectivity went from occasional to constant. Maps folded into screens. Waiting faded into instant response. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, your brain didn't just witness this transition, it grew inside it. You are not fully Generation X. You are not entirely Millennials. You are Xennials, a microgeneration that lived both the quiet edges of presence and the blurred infinity of the always online world. This isn't just nostalgia, it's neurological. Because childhood is when the nervous system calibrates to reality, and your calibration period happened in a world that no longer exists. Your childhood was analog, even if your adulthood is not. You remember rewinding cassette tapes with a pencil, the weight of a cordless phone that wasn't truly cordless, the sound of a 56K modem singing its metallic arrival song. You remember when Saturday morning cartoons required patience, when photos took days to exist, when boredom wasn't a glitch, it was the default state. Before algorithms anticipated your preferences, you had to generate your own stimulation. Long afternoons stretched. Nothing buzzed. Nothing glowed in your hand. Silence wasn't suspicious. Psychologists call it the default mode network, the brain's inward creative state. But for you, it was just Tuesday. You learned how to sit inside your own thoughts. You learned how to invent. You learned how to wait. And waiting did something subtle to your nervous system. It built tolerance. It built imagination. It built the muscle of delayed gratification long before productivity books began selling it back to you. That analog childhood left a psychological imprint. You can tolerate stillness without panic. But the world you grew into does not reward stillness. Adolescence is when identity softens and stretches, when the question, "Who am I?" feels urgent and unfinished. For Xennials, adolescence coincided with technological acceleration. 1 year, research meant an encyclopedia. A few years later, it meant a search engine. 1 year, connection meant a phone attached to a wall. A few years later, it meant email addresses and screen names and chat rooms humming late into the night. You were old enough to remember the before, young enough to master the after. That combination created something psychologically rare: technological bilingualism. You speak analog fluently, eye contact, pauses, physical presence, awkward silences that teach repair instead of retreat. You also speak digital, curated profiles, typed tone, asynchronous intimacy. But here is the difference between you and those younger. The internet was never the air you breathed. It was a place you visited. You logged on and you logged off. There was a boundary. And because you remember that boundary, part of your nervous system still believes it should exist. Adulthood arrived, and with it, constant connection. Email followed you home. Laptops followed you onto couches. Then smartphones dissolved the final perimeter between presence and demand. For those born later, this was normal. For you, it was an intrusion that arrived after identity had already formed. You remember when work stayed at work. You remember when if someone needed you, they waited. You remember when being unreachable was ordinary. Now, adulthood lives inside an always-on field. Notifications puncture evenings. Group threads pulse in your pocket. There is no clean perimeter to the day. And this creates a subtle cognitive friction for Xennials. You adapted to constant connectivity, but you never internalized it as natural. Part of you still expects intervals, pauses, edges, that quiet friction. between the memory of off and the impossibility of escape becomes a low-grade tension many of you carry without naming. Every generation is shaped by historical timing, but for Xennials, disruption arrived precisely at launch. You grew up in the long afterglow of the 1990s, a decade that felt stable, optimistic, upward. The Cold War had ended, the economy expanded, technology promised progress, not volatility. The message was simple: study hard, go to college, step into a wider future. And then the timing shifted. The dot-com bubble burst just as many of you were entering college or the workforce. Stability evaporated early. Then came September 11th attacks. For older generations, it interrupted midlife. For you, it struck at the threshold of adulthood. The moment of first independence, first apartments, first plans. The psychological message was immediate. The world can change overnight. Then, just as footing solidified, the Great Recession landed when many of you were approaching milestones. Buying homes, consolidating careers, forming families. Again, the ground shifted. Stacked disruptions create a particular worldview, hopeful but scanning, optimistic but cautious. You believe effort matters, but you also expect systems to fail. You plan carefully, you keep exits in mind. The world didn't change before you were ready. It changed exactly when you stepped forward. Identity usually grows from belonging to a clear cohort, a shared story you can point to and say, "That's mine." But Xennials often feel slightly out of focus, too young for the hardened detachment often associated with Gen X, too analog for the seamless digital fluency of Millennials. So, you learn to translate rather than inhabit. You understand older skepticism about rapid change. You understand younger comfort with fluid identity. But recognition is not the same as belonging. Over time, this produces a subtle internal narrative. I adapt everywhere, but I originate nowhere. There is strength here. Psychologists call it cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold contradictions without collapse. You bridge frameworks, industrial logic and digital logic, hierarchy and iteration, privacy and performance. You are comfortable in transition because transition trained you. But bridges are rarely celebrated. Their work is to carry movement quietly. You often operate in that same space, stabilizing conversations, reframing tensions, connecting timelines, without being named as central. If you are raising children now, you are raising digital natives with analog memory. You remember bikes without tracking apps, afternoons without supervision, mistakes that faded because they weren't archived. But your children grow up partially public, partially searchable, partially documented, and this creates a quiet parental dissonance. You want to give them the boredom that shaped you, the offline space, the privacy of experimentation, yet removing them from digital life entirely risks isolation. Immersing them fully risks exposure. So you parent across worlds. You negotiate screens. You encourage outdoors. You explain in algorithms your own parents never had to imagine. Beneath this balancing act lives something rarely acknowledged, a small grief, not for your childhood, but for the knowledge that its conditions cannot be fully recreated. By midlife, responsibilities accumulate for everyone. But for Xennials, they often converge. Above you, parents aging longer, needing coordination and care. Below you, children growing in a more complex and exposed environment. And between these gravitational pulls, you hold your own life in suspension. Career stability often arrived later than expected. Economic disruptions delayed milestones, so adulthood feels compressed. Responsibilities intensifying just as footing becomes stable. Psychologists describe this as role strain, multiple high-demand roles drawing from the same finite reservoir of energy. Caregiver, parent, worker, partner. translator between generations. Fatigue accumulates not only from tasks, but from position, the structural middle. You absorb pressure from both directions. You're expected to manage upward and downward simultaneously. Support often flows through you more than toward you. This is not collapse. It is continuous load. There is something you carry that is becoming rare. Lived memory of a human pace before constant connection. You remember when attention had margins, when friendships deepened without documentation, when thoughts formed slowly and remained private. As the world accelerates, your memory becomes more than nostalgia. It becomes cultural evidence that another tempo existed. That boredom once opened into imagination. That identity once formed without audience. After you, childhood begins already connected, already searchable, already seen. And this is why your experience matters. Because in a hyper-digital age, the future still needs people who remember the value of pause, of off, of presence without mediation. If you recognize yourself here, in this bridge between analog and digital, optimism and caution, belonging and translation, you are not invisible. You are continuity. You are what transition looks like when it becomes human. And if this reflection resonated with you, subscribe to Lucis. I'd love to hear from you. If you're a Xennial, what is one analog memory you still carry vividly? The first email address you ever made? The last time you memorized phone numbers? The sound of that modem connecting? Share it in the comments. Let's map the last childhood that began offline, while it's still within living reach. Thank you for watching.